Hi everybody and welcome back to another JS Drop from this dot. If you want to learn about the latest in Node, you've come to the right place because today, Colin Ihrig from the Node.js Technical Steering Committee will present on recent changes to Node and what developers can look forward to. Let's get started.
Hi, thank you for coming to my talk today. I'm going to be talking about the state of Node.js core. My name is Colin Ihrig. I am a member of the Node.js Technical Steering Committee, have been for a few years now, have been working on the project since, I think, 2014. And I wanted to talk about some of the recent changes in the project, some things that could be coming up on the horizon, as well as just a review of the various release lines that Node.js is currently supporting. So with that, let's dive right in. I wanted to start off by saying that Node.js still seems to be popular. So what this graph shows is the total number of downloads from Node.js.org over the past approximately 2 years. I believe this data goes to March of 2021. And so other than the couple dips that you see that correspond to like the Christmas holiday, you can see that the downloads are still going up and to the right, which means that, as time goes on, we are downloading Node.js more and more often. The ecosystem is also similarly still popular. This graph shows a count of downloads, a count of modules on various package managers across different programming languages. So, we have Rust on here, Python, Ruby, and some others. But the line that is, far and away higher than everything else represents NPM. So NPM, as far as I know, is the only package manager that has over 2 million packages on it. It continues to grow, but this is just kind of a disclaimer that not all of the modules on NPM are great. There are some that are great, there are others that are not. But just as far as raw module counts go, NPM is ahead of everyone else. So next, I wanted to talk about the Node.js long-term support schedule, otherwise known as LTS. So the red line that you see on the screen here represents where we are today. The yellowish horizontal line labeled as unstable represents the main development branch. So every single commit that goes into Node.js lands on this branch. It doesn't matter if it's a patch, a new feature, or a breaking change, everything lands there. And then the way it works is we have these various release lines that we backport commits to. And so that way, we can make sure to leave out things like breaking changes from other release lines. And so if you look here, we currently are supporting Node 14, 16, 18, 19, and then coming up soon in April, we'll have Node 20. So Node 14 is the oldest. It's currently in what is known as maintenance. This is the phase of the release where you just kind of get security patches and very few other things. So the branches, the release line is still alive, but it's not really getting so many updates anymore. It's very stable. Same thing with Node 16. So right now it's also in maintenance mode. But if you look at Node 18, it's currently highlighted in blue. That means it's in active LTS. So the way it works is every April and October, the Node project cuts a new major release. And the releases that are cut in April are going to be even numbered. And they go on to something called active LTS, which means it receives all of the patches and new features that land on Node's main branch without all of the breaking changes. And that happens for the period of a year. And then after a year, it transitions into maintenance mode, which I already talked a little bit about, for 18 months before it goes completely end of life. The major releases that come out in October are odd numbered releases. So in October of last year, we got Node 19. So Node 19 is what we call the current release. It also gets all of the bug fixes and new features, but they're released right away. Whereas once something enters active LTS, we require that a feature has been released into the current branch for at least 2 weeks, and that's just to make sure that things are out there and getting tested and are stable before we go ahead and backport to LTS. So Node 19 is the current branch. In a few months here, it's going to transition into a shortened maintenance period. The odd numbered branches never become LTS. They have a couple months at the end of their life of maintenance so that people can migrate off of them. But generally, we don't recommend using these branches in production. And then coming up in April, you can see that Node 20 will be released. When that happens, it will become the current branch. It'll go through 6 months of being the current branch before October it transitions into active LTS. So next I wanted to dive into each release line in a little bit more detail and talk about what's going on there. So Node 14 is actually coming up on its end of life fairly soon. So that'll be at the end of April of 2023. You can probably expect 1 or 2 more releases of Node 14, but I would definitely recommend that if you are running Node 14, that you start the process of migrating to something newer at this point. I'm personally going to recommend Node 18 as the target for what you should be migrating to. And the reason for that brings me to the next slide, which is that Node 16 is also going to be going end of life this year. So normally, Node 16 would have been in maintenance mode until April of 2024. However, we moved that date up to September 11th of 2023, which is 7 months earlier than it normally would be. But the reason for that is the version of OpenSSL that ships with Node 16 is also going to be end of life in September 11th. And so, the options were to, basically maintain Node 16 with an insecure version of OpenSSL, or try to maintain OpenSSL ourselves, or to basically cut the lifetime short. And that's what we chose to do. I think it was the best option for the project as well as for end users. So again, start migrating off of Node 16 right now. If you do want to read more about why this is coming to be, I have the link here at the bottom of the slide where you can go and read the full announcement. But again, I recommend targeting Node 18 here. So speaking of Node 18, it is currently in active LTS, as I mentioned earlier. It has the code name of Hydrogen. So all of our release lines that make it into LTS are given a code name based on the periodic table of elements. And so, for example, Node, I think 4 was argon, Node 6 was boron, I think Node 8 was carbon, and on, up until the H's, which is where we're at with Node 18. We use the name hydrogen. There are some letters that don't have a periodic table element associated with them. In that case, we just kind of make up elements. So yeah, this is currently in active LTS. It will go into maintenance in October of this year, but you can run it in production all the way up until April of 2025 when it finally hits its end of life. And between now and then, you'll also have plenty of opportunities to migrate to newer release lines. Node 18 is very stable at this point, and this is what I would really recommend running in production if you are a company who depends on Node for core business value. So next I wanted to talk about Node 19 really quickly. Originally it was released in October of 2022. It'll be the current release line through April of this year. It will not enter LTS, and it will be end of life in June of 2023. Do not recommend using this in production, even though it's often tempting to use the latest and greatest. It's just the odd numbered branches just aren't as stable as the even numbered branches. And generally it's okay, but if you really want to be sure, do not run them in production. And then one thing that is notable with the Node 19 branch is that this release line removes support for probes for dtrace, system tap, and ETW. The reason for that is just that Node is a project run by volunteers, and there was literally nobody who was stepping up to maintain them, so they were ripped out. But there is currently an open issue on the issue tracker about bringing them back if somebody was motivated to do that. So out of all the release lines that I just talked about, I have another graph here that shows their downloads over time. So you can kind of see the blue line, which represents node 14. It starts, it was already being used at the beginning of this chart. And then, there was a Christmas drop off and then kind of a larger drop off coming after that. Node 16, which is in the orange, is our currently most popular and most downloaded release line. You can see at near the beginning of the graph when it was released, and it just gradually grew and grew over time. It's kind of leveled off here at the end, like towards the right side of the graph, and almost looks like it could be declining. Again, I'm hoping that it's declining. The yellow bar is what we really want to see take off. So that represents node 18. I haven't showed node 15 or 17 on here because they're already well past their end of life. Node 18, you can see where it comes into existence and slowly starts to grow. So I'd like to really see that overtake node 16 in the coming weeks and months. And then node 19, which showed up towards the end of the graph, has a little bit of adoption, but like I said, we don't want to see that really take off. So, if you're running Node.js in production, you're probably wondering, how do I pick a version to run in production? I've already said that, we recommend officially using an LTS version. People are not always going to listen to that. So you really need to ask yourself, is Node really mission critical? So if your website where you're making money depends on Node, then it's probably mission critical. If it just is used for some internal tooling and you can handle some downtime or some breakage, then feel free to experiment with the newer and odd numbered release lines. If you can't update frequently and easily, I definitely recommend staying on an LTS version because there's going to be more changes and a faster release cadence with the odd numbered versions. And then, everybody wants the new features, but you have to ask yourself, do you actually need the new features? In most cases, the answer is no. It's just, we're all engineers and we like to play with the newest things. So next I wanted to talk about some of the new features that have come to Node via the V8 project. So we have something called shadow realms via the -- experimental shadow realm command line flag. So this landed in V8 also behind a flag because it's still unstable. But we added our own flag in Node to kind of expose it. Shadow realms are nice. If you're familiar with Node's VM module, it's something kind of similar to that. It allows you to run code in a separate context, except this actually is part of the JavaScript language. It's still being stabilized, but it's kind of the language's answer to the VM module. We've also got a couple new methods on arrays. So find last and find last index. These are the same as find and find index, just they search from the back of the array instead of the front. There's been some improvements in internationalization. So the locale API had some improvements. The number format API was added, and we have a new method called supported values of. So if you're into internationalization, these things will be useful to you. If not, just know that they're there. Another thing is improved performance for class fields and methods. So we have a new way of using class fields inside of JavaScript. There are private ones, so we actually have real private data now instead of hiding things behind symbols. When they first landed in V8, and this is kind of the case for a lot of brand new features, is the performance is not always as good as it will eventually be. So even though these new class fields and methods were there, a lot of times, at least in Node Core, we would not actively use them because they would slow down the application. But in recent versions of V8, that's changed. They're now on par with everything else, and you should feel free to use them in your code as well. And then the final thing is something for WebAssembly users out there. It's called the JavaScript Promise Integration API, and that is a way of taking your WebAssembly code and hooking it up to asynchronous JavaScript code. So if you've ever done any WebAssembly programming before, it's really limited in what it can do on its own. And so oftentimes you'll have to call out to something like WASI or JavaScript code to implement missing pieces of functionality. But in the past, there hasn't been a good way to do that with asynchronous code. And so this is kind of that missing piece that I think will really help JavaScript and WebAssembly integration take off and be a lot more productive than it has been in the past. Next thing I wanted to talk about were some new features that we got from the web platform and the ongoing efforts there to be more compatible with the web platform. So fetch was a really big one. There were people who asked for fetch inside of Node for years. We finally made fetch happen, and so it's there and you can use it. I believe technically that it's still unstable, but it is stable enough that you can feel comfortable using it. And then a number of other APIs and globals that kind of came along with fetch are the request and response objects, form data, and some other things. We've also added web streams. So web streams are kind of the browser world's answer to Node streams. And so this is a really interesting feature in Node because it's one of the few pieces of code I've ever seen that is actually slow enough that you can debug it with the naked eye. So the performance will improve over time. It's not there right now, but it is a solid implementation, and we've added some things to make working with them a little nicer, which I'll talk about later. We have web crypto. We have structured clone, which is really nice for not having to use things like object.assign or the old trick of JSON stringify followed by JSON parse to kind of make copies of things. And then some other things, text encoder and decoder, blob, file, event targets. There's more. I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I won't list and go into everything in detail, but Node's compatibility with the web platform is increasing over time, which is a good thing. Next, I wanted to talk about Node's test runner. So this was something that I actually worked on myself. We are considering making it stable in Node 20. It's still technically unstable as well. I'm using it in production, not production because it's test code, but I'm using it in modules that are actually used in production for testing. And it has worked really well for me. So I also encourage you to give it a try. So there are a few different ways that you can try it out. There is the node::test module inside of core. There is a CLI test runner built into core, which is the -- test flag. And then for older versions of Node, people have actually taken the code in Node core and pulled it out into an NPM module called test, which you can download from NPM and play around with as well. So the test runner supports a lot of the common things that you would expect from a test runner, subtests. You can skip over tests. You can have tests marked as only and run those. Lifecycle hooks such as before each, after each, and things like that. We've also built mocking and code coverage into it. So code coverage is available via the -- experimental test coverage CLI flag. It's more experimental than the rest of the test runner, so it has its own experimental flag to kind of warn people. And then we've also added test reporters recently. So you can say, test reporter, I want to output my test format in TAP, which stands for the test anything protocol, or maybe something that's a little more human readable. You can also define your own test reporters, and then the test reporter destination that goes along with that, meaning do I want to send this output to standard out, standard error, a file, etc., things like that. And by default, the test runner writes TAP to standard output. So this is what this is how you would actually write tests. So you see I'm importing Node's assert module as well as the test module. And then I have a very simple synchronous passing test. The second test is asynchronous. So you can have synchronous code, asynchronous functions, code that returns promises, and we actually do support callbacks because there are still a lot of legacy Node APIs that work with callbacks. And then this is kind of two samples of what the output look like. So on the left is tap. It's not the most human readable, but there are a lot of tools that can consume it and transform it. And it's not node specific. There's tap, across multiple programming languages and tools. And then on the right is one of the new reporters, which runs things, or I'm sorry, displays things in a little more human friendly way. So we have some nice colors and symbols and things like that. We've also added what we call node prefixed only core modules. And so I have an example here. So on the top, we're importing the test and assert modules. On the bottom, we're doing the same thing, but you'll notice the node : prefix in the top example. All core modules support this syntax. So if you want to make sure that you're loading something from core and not userland, you can look for that node : and be sure that you're getting the core module. The interesting thing on the bottom is the test module was the very first core module that only works with the node prefix. So in the top, you're loading both modules from core. On the bottom, you're loading assert from core and test from userland or node modules. So this was something that I personally voted against because I think it gives a confusing and inconsistent user experience. But it's the direction that the TSC decided to go in, so it's something that you should be aware of. We've also added watch mode, so there's a -- watch flag that you can use. It will watch any imported files that your code runs, and if you change any of those, Node.js will automatically restart and run your process again, similar to something like NodeMon. It does integrate with the test runner, so if you run your tests, change some code or some test code, it will automatically run your tests again. And then on macOS and Windows, you can actually customize which files you want the watch mode to watch using the -- watch path flag. So that's something else that you should be aware of and hopefully utilize. Another thing that we're hoping to stabilize in Node 20 is util.parseArgs. And this is a utility function that makes parsing command line options simpler and more consistent and built into core. So it's part of the util module. You import the parseArgs function, and then you give it an array of arguments as well as a schema, as you can see here. And then when you call parseArgs, it'll map the arguments you give it onto that schema. And so you can see the print statement at the bottom here shows foo is true and bar is a string called b. That's consistent with the schema that we provided, where foo should be a Boolean and bar should be a string. Some other notable changes, we're always keeping NPM up to date. We have some streams helpers, so things like map and for each and things that you would normally do on arrays, you can now do on node streams as well. We've also provided some APIs for going back and forth between node streams and web streams, so that'll even further help with compatibility with the web platform. fs.statfs is something that I added recently to core because I needed it for my job, and that will basically let you get information on like disk utilization and things like that, which wasn't possible in Node without it. Happy Eyeballs is finally in core now. So Happy Eyeballs, if you have IPv4 and IPv6, it will actually try both of them, and then whichever one responds first is what your application will use. OS.available parallelism. If you've ever used Rust's available parallelism, it is based off of the same concept there. This is because we added this because a lot of times when people were trying to figure out how many tasks they should use, like how many threads to spawn or something like that, they would normally look at the number of CPUs on the machine and base it off of that. But that number can actually change. CPUs can go offline and other things can happen. So, instead of using CPUs, we recommend using this new API. We have a diagnostic channel that's built into core. If you ever used that before, it has been expanded, so it now provides diagnostics on even more parts of the core API. There's a new URL parser. It's based off of a native library called Ada. It's from what I've seen, significantly faster than the URL parser that we had before. We have HTTPS imports, so you can actually import something directly from GitHub or any other HTTPS address. I would caution here to be careful because npm does a lot of things for you, like making sure that packages don't disappear or change. If you're using an HTTPS import, that is no longer the case, so be careful. There's a startup snapshot API. So snapshotting helps Node and other things based on V8 start up faster by serializing the JavaScript heap and then just reading it from that snapshot instead of instantiating all of your JavaScript objects when it starts up. So there's now a userland API exposed for doing that. It's fairly simple at this point, but it's expected to grow as time goes on. Snapshot testing is something that we were supporting. People weren't generally happy with how the snapshot API was implemented, so we've removed that for now. Hopefully, we'll be adding it back with a better implementation, but that's something to be aware of. And then diagnostic reports have been improved with more information about the heap, and there's a lot more, but I'm kind of constrained on time. I wanted to briefly talk about the state of Node's testing. So every time we make a commit to Node, we run about 4,000 tests on it across a wide variety of operating systems as well as different configurations. So, with and without internationalization, with or without crypto and things like that. When I very first gave this talk, there were, back in I think 2015, there were about 1,000 tests. And the last time I gave the talk in 2019, there were only 2,800. So the number of tests in core is continuing to grow. The JS code coverage is in a good spot. It's at about 96%. C++ code coverage is a little bit lower at about 89%. These have roughly stayed the same over the years, maybe gone up and down, but roughly held steady. And then I wanted to talk about some upcoming features. So there's a permission system in the works. So things that you can lock down, being able to access things like child processes or workers or different parts of the file system. There is a plan that somebody is trying to work on for better TypeScript integration because Node doesn't want to ship TypeScript, bundled into it. The reason is TypeScript it doesn't follow semver and other various things. So trying to commit to something like that in a long-term support release just wouldn't be feasible. There's a pull request currently for single executable applications. So this would allow you to bundle your Node and all of your applications into a single executable that you could distribute, and then those people who are using it don't need to have Node or npm even installed. There's been ongoing work for a few years on Quick, which is essentially HTTP 3. I would say progress there is slow, but it's steadily going. Fetch, we're looking into adding proxy support via the HTTP proxy environment variable. So Fetch would be smart enough to automatically handle proxies along the network path. And then we've been introducing promiseified versions of all of our core modules over time. I think most recently we added the readline module. There are still a few that could be promiseified. So child process is one that comes to mind. So we'll likely be spending more time on that. There are other upcoming features too, but these were kind of the big ones that stood out to me. And then I wanted to talk about some important links. So if you think you found a bug or want to request a feature in Node, you would go to GitHub, Node.js/Node. If you just have a support question, which isn't a bug report or a feature request, we have a help repo where you can go and people will, actually respond to your questions and things like that. Think of it like Stack Overflow, but hosted in the Node.js GitHub org. If you're curious about anything related to releases, like I talked about earlier, there's a Node.js/release repo that has the LTS schedule and all of the important dates for all of the release lines. If you want to report a security issue, the issue tracker is not the place to do that. We have a HackerOne account where you can responsibly disclose security issues to the Node core team, and we'll get in touch with back to you. And if we deem it to be a security issue, we can coordinate on a security release. And then finally, there's the OpenJS Foundation Slack. We have two primary channels in there, hashtag Node.js and hashtag Node.js core. These are Node.js is for general Node.js questions. Node.js core is where the core team kind of hangs out and talks about developing Node itself. And with that, I just wanted to give a quick plug to Platformatic, which is the company that I'm currently working with. It's redesigning APIs, making it easier to set up, GraphQL APIs, REST APIs, various things like that. They've also been sponsoring some of my work on Node Core, so please try it out, and thank you to them. And that's everything for me. So once again, thanks for coming, and have a good rest of your day.